Arthur Dayne stood on the wind-battered ramparts of Dragonstone, the storm whipping the silver fringe of his pale hair against his forehead. Far below, the sea churned with a restless ferocity that mirrored the turmoil in his own heart. All the glory and pride he had once carried in the name of the Kingsguard had been ground into dust by the catastrophe of war. A long red cloak flapped behind him, salt-stained and rain-spattered, the seven-pointed star embroidered at the collar dulled by sorrow. Dawn, the ancestral greatsword of House Dayne, rested against the rampart stone. Its milky blade gleamed faintly in the twilight, as though resisting the gloom that clung to the castle. Arthur's gaze swept across the horizon, where lightning split the sky. His oath had been as firm as Valyrian steel, to protect the royal family at any cost. Yet the world that he had once known lay in ruins. King Aerys II Targaryen, mad, cruel, dangerous, was dead. Rhaegar, the bright prince to whom Arthur had devoted his loyalty, had perished on the Trident. The capital had fallen. He tried to recall the sense of unwavering duty that had coursed through him when he first became a Kingsguard knight, but all he found was a dogged determination to fulfill what little remained of his oath. Even if the kingship had fallen, he was still sworn to protect the Targaryen bloodline. No matter the cost, Arthur Dayne would do what needed to be done. He turned from the storm and strode inward, his boots echoing along the torchlit corridors of Dragonstone. Servants rushed by, carrying crates of supplies, bundles of clothing, dried food, and casks of water. Everyone moved with a desperation that betrayed how fragile their situation was. There was no telling how soon Stannis Baratheon's fleet might appear on the horizon. Time was short and each hour was precious. Arthur knocked gently on the door of the Solar. A royal guard in black and red livery opened it for him, stepping aside in silent deference. The room inside was dimly lit by flickering lanterns, their flames dancing on the drapes that billowed from the gusts of wind sneaking through a small window. Rhaella was seated in a high-backed chair near the hearth, her once lustrous silver-gold hair dull from exhaustion and sorrow. Her hands rested over her swollen belly in a protective gesture. Her violet eyes, reminiscent of the fabled Valyrian ancestry of House Targaryen, rose to meet Arthur's. He bowed low. "Your Grace," he said softly, noticing a quiet tension about her. "We must make ready soon," she replied, her voice strained. "My child, this child must be kept safe. We have lost so much." Her voice trembled, and Arthur's heart clenched to see the grief etched upon her face. She had lost her firstborn, Rhaegar, and then the two younger children, Rhaenys and Aegon, had perished in King's Landing during the sack. Now all that remained was the unborn babe she carried. Arthur nodded, trying to find the words that would give her comfort. "We will keep you safe, my queen. I swear it." She studied his face for a moment, perhaps searching for a hint of the unwavering certainty he had once possessed. If she found anything, she did not show it. Instead, she glanced toward the window. The storm raged outside, and lightning lit the sky in molten flashes. "The blood of old Valyria may yet survive," she whispered. "But we must be swift." He told her of the preparations. A ship waited in the harbor, a reliable Lysene trading vessel that had been quietly acquired through the last of her loyal retainers. The Lysene captain, driven more by coin than by politics, had agreed to sail them to Essos. They would need to evade any blockade, but the captain claimed to know hidden coves and sea routes. Perhaps the narrow channels between the islands would shield them from detection. Once they reached the open sea, they would set sail for Pentos or Bravos, whichever proved safer. Rhaella's breathing grew heavier as he spoke. The pregnancy had been difficult. Stress and grief gnawed at her, and her health was in precarious shape. Arthur knelt before her, gently taking her hand. "We'll leave at first light," he said. "Rest if you can, Your Grace. The crossing will not be easy." She shut her eyes. "Thank you, Sir Arthur. Truly." With her quiet words hanging in the air, he excused himself and moved to finalize their departure. In the courtyard, he met Ser Willem Darry, another knight loyal to the Targaryens who had helped negotiate the ship's passage. Ser Willem's eyes were red-rimmed, and he wore a worn, anxious expression. Once a steadfast presence at Rhaegar's side, Darry had quickly aged in the chaotic aftermath of the rebellion. "It's almost time," Arthur said to him. Ser Willem swallowed, glancing at the darkening sky. "Gods be good, we'll make it to dawn." He looked Arthur in the eye. "If I fall, promise me you'll see her to safety." Arthur placed a hand on the man's shoulder. "We'll not fail you or our queen. We'll see her across the sea." The night crept by in tense preparation. Though they had arranged for a discreet departure, the risk of spies loomed large. Any rumor of Rhaella Targaryen fleeing would bring Baratheon ships bearing down upon them. Soldiers loyal to the new king might lie in wait for the queen's capture. While the largest threat seemed to be Stannis, as Lord of Dragonstone, Arthur refused to underestimate even lesser lords who might seek favor with Robert Baratheon by delivering the last Targaryen. At first light, while the storm still lingered, they carried Rhaella down to the docks. The wind was sharp, slicing across the shore like a blade. She wore a simple gray cloak over her pregnant belly, and her face was pale, but her chin was lifted with a regal poise that reminded Arthur of the old house Targaryen. The small retinue of loyal servants walked behind, heads bowed, carrying chests of essential items, royal heirlooms, medicine, and modest clothing. Arthur and Ser Willem flanked the queen, each scanning their surroundings with nervous vigilance. The castle portcullis rose, and they descended a narrow path etched into the rocky cliffs. The Lyseni ship bobbed at the harbor, sails furled against the wind. A handful of dockworkers loaded the last crates while the captain hurried them aboard. The moment the queen set foot on the vessel, Arthur let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. They were committed now. There would be no going back. Dawn strapped across his back, he guided Rhaella to a modest cabin. No grander accommodations available on the small trade cog. The cabin smelled faintly of fish and damp wood, but at least it was private. He caught a glimpse of her expression as she looked around. Perhaps she never believed her life would be reduced to such meager circumstances, but she said nothing. Instead, she settled onto the thin pallet, exhaustion overwhelming her. Arthur covered her with a fur. She nodded in thanks and closed her eyes, clearly in pain or discomfort from her pregnancy. The ship set sail amid the fading thunder. The sky was washed in the pale glow of a reluctant sun. Arthur stood at the prow beside Ser Willem, both knights scanning the water for signs of unfriendly sails. The tension was palpable. Each minute on the open sea was a minute closer to either salvation or disaster. Waves rocked the ship as they rounded the rocky spurs protecting Dragonstone's harbor. Arthur could sense the weight of so many souls behind him, anxious and fearful. Rhaella's life was in his hands, as was the life of her unborn child, House Targaryen's final hope. He murmured prayers to the Seven, and in his mind, he imagined a quiet voice urging him onward. Once, he had been called the Sword of the Morning, a shining figure of chivalry. Now, only duty remained, stripped of fanfare and ceremony. 2 days passed at sea without incident. The captain worked his crew hard to keep a good pace. They skirted the usual shipping lanes, taking a more circuitous route to avoid detection. The Lyseni seemed wary, casting nervous glances at his passengers, but gold could ease many fears. Though the storms had lessened, the wind still blew strong, and the waves rose high enough to threaten the smaller craft. Ser Willem and Arthur took turns checking on the queen, ensuring she ate and drank, though her appetite was nearly non-existent. On the third day, just before dawn, Arthur was awakened by a frantic knock at his small cabin door. One of the crew shouted that another ship had been sighted, flags indistinct in the early morning gloom. Arthur scrambled up to the deck, hand on Dawn's hilt. The wind tore at his cloak as he squinted across the rolling black waters. There, indeed, was a dark shape in the distance, moving fast. The captain cursed under his breath. "We'll run for that island chain," the Lyseni growled, pointing to a faint shadow of land that rose from the sea like a jagged reef. "If they're pirates, or worse, we'll lose them in the shallows." Arthur nodded. His chest felt tight. If it were Baratheon ships, they would be done for. Even if it were pirates, the queen was in danger. He rushed below deck to ensure Rhaella was well, finding her propped up by pillows. Her face was drawn, but she tried to steel herself. "What is it?" she asked, voice trembling. "Possibly trouble. We will do all we can to evade them." She closed her eyes, exhaling slowly. "We must not be taken," she managed, her hands unconsciously curling around her belly. He knelt at her bedside. "We will not be," he said, though he could not summon the confidence he wished. His vow must be enough, or else House Targaryen would vanish from the world entirely. Above deck, dawn broke with a bruised pink sky. The silhouette of the pursuing ship loomed closer, but the Lyseni captain navigated into labyrinthine channels weaving around rocky islets. The waters grew treacherous, and more than once, the hull scraped across hidden reefs. But by midday, the other ship was nowhere to be seen. Whether lost or merely not interested in continuing a risky chase, it faded back into open sea. Arthur expelled a breath, relief washing over him. Another week passed, and the journey stabilized. Rhaella's condition remained uncertain. Her pregnancy advanced, and the stress took its toll. Often, Arthur would find her quiet, half awake, gazing at the cabin walls. She barely spoke of her late children, but the sorrow lingered in her eyes. Sometimes, she would murmur a name in her sleep, Rhaegar, Aegon, Rhaenys, and tears would slip down her cheeks. Arthur, standing guard, could only listen in silence. At last, after what felt like an eternity, the coast of Essos came into view. Low, sandy shores rose to meet them, with the silhouette of a port city in the distance. The Lyseni captain intended to dock at a small trading town north of Pentos. From there, they could hire an escort or another ship or possibly travel overland. Arthur and Ser Willem deliberated on where the queen would be safest. Braavos was known for its anti-slavery stance and might offer more anonymity, but Pentos was a known haven for exiled nobles. The question was which city would hold fewer potential threats, or fewer bounty hunters eager to collect coin from Robert Baratheon. They agreed on Pentos, if only because they had a chance of finding more Targaryen sympathizers there. House Targaryen's ties to the free cities were ancient, and though many lords would hesitate to openly defy Westeros's new king, gold and tradition still had power. The Lyseni captain, content to have them off his ship, exchanged small pleasantries and accepted final payment from Ser Willem. Rhaella was escorted onto the dock by Arthur and the small retinue. She took a trembling step on solid ground, inhaling the unfamiliar air of Essos. Arthur sensed her fear and uncertainty. The land felt different beneath their feet, warmer, drier, with the sense of spiced wine and foreign cooking drifting from the taverns near the port. Dockworkers, fishmongers, and traders milled about, eyeing the newcomers. A few looked with curiosity upon the pale-haired woman, who moved with a regal bearing despite her obvious fatigue. Arthur guided them to an inn near the waterfront. They took 2 cramped rooms, but it was enough to afford the queen a bed and privacy. Ser Willem went to make inquiries about horses or a carriage for the journey to Pentos. Meanwhile, Arthur checked the windows and doors, ensuring they were locked and secure. He felt a constant knot of apprehension in his stomach. The air was tangy with salt and the promise of unknown dangers. Here, in this foreign land, they had few friends and many possible foes. That evening, as the sun sank in a blaze of orange and purple, Arthur brought the queen a bowl of broth and a small loaf of bread. She had managed to get some rest but woke with a frightened start when he knocked at the door. She blinked, then seemed to remember where she was. "Ser Arthur," she said, forcing a tight smile. "Thank you." She sipped from the broth, wincing at its heat. He stood guard by the door, watching her with concern. "How do you fare, your grace?" She shook her head. "I am alive, and for now that is enough." Her voice cracked. "I only pray this child will be born healthy." He inclined his head. "I am certain the gods will watch over you, my queen." Yet he knew that even the gods' mercy could be unpredictable. "Ser Willem believes we can set out tomorrow for Pentos. We'll hire a covered carriage. It should be a journey of 4 or 5 days, perhaps less if the roads are clear." She listened, nodding slowly. And once we arrive in Pentos, there are a few magisters reputed to be friendly to exiles, including one named Illyrio Mopatus, Arthur said. He had overheard the name whispered among merchants. He may shelter you. We must tread carefully, for we cannot trust everyone, but we must try. Rhaella closed her eyes, as if summoning her last reserves of resolve. I will follow your guidance, Sir Arthur. You have been loyal beyond measure. His throat tightened. All he had done, all he would do, was simply his duty. But hearing her words brought a flicker of warmth to his weary heart. Rest, my queen. I will stand guard. She finished her small meal, lying back against the bed. Arthur tucked a thin blanket over her. The flame of the candle on the nightstand flickered, reflecting off the tears that glistened on her cheeks before she turned her face away. They set out at dawn, the sky a cool slate gray, the roads half muddied by a drizzle that had fallen in the night. Their small party consisted of the Queen's carriage, pulled by a pair of sturdy brown horses, and 2 additional horses bearing Arthur and Sir Willem. 2 servants accompanied them, one driving the carriage and the other assisting the Queen. They traveled east, skirting farmland and olive groves, passing through villages that bore little resemblance to the hamlets of Westeros. It was a strange land of terracotta roofs and whitewashed walls, of vendors hawking spiced meats and citrus fruit. Along the way, they encountered few troubles, though Arthur remained ever alert. The roads were patrolled by mercenary companies from time to time, their loyalties up for hire. One group of sellswords passed them with mild disinterest, and Arthur felt a surge of relief when they did not stop. On the second day, they halted at a small inn near a stream, the carriages while having broken on a rocky rut. While the servants worked on repairs, Rhaella was helped inside to rest. Arthur went out to gather fresh water and found himself momentarily transfixed by the reflection of his own face in the stream. He looked older, wearier. He wondered if the name Arthur Dayne would one day fade into obscurity here, far from Starfall and Dorne, and how the men of his line would judge him for abandoning Westeros. But no, he had not abandoned his kingdom, he told himself. He had chosen to protect the last hope for the line he had sworn to serve. This was the only path left to him. Late that afternoon, Arthur heard Rhaella cry out from her makeshift bed in the inn. He rushed to her side. Her face was contorted in pain, and her breath came in frantic gasps. The innkeeper, an older woman with keen eyes, touched Rhaella's forehead and barked instructions to boil water and fetch clean linens. Arthur's blood ran cold as he realized the baby was coming too soon. There were at least some weeks left before the expected birth. Sir Willem ran in, panic flashing across his features. "She cannot give birth here," he stammered. "This place, it is unfit." Yet there was no choice. The labor had begun, and Rhaella's body was racked by contractions. Arthur stood helpless, watching as the innkeeper and the Queen's female servant hurried to aid her. They cleared the small dining area of the inn, laying down blankets. Rhaella groaned, tears mingling with sweat. Arthur's heart pounded as he realized how precarious her life now hung. They had no maester, only what meager knowledge the old innkeeper possessed. Time stretched in an agonizing blur. Outside, the sky turned from late afternoon gold to dusk's purple shadows. Rhaella's cries echoed off the wooden walls, tearing at Arthur's composure. He knelt by the door, praying. Sir Willem paced like a caged animal. Then, deep in the night, the cry of a newborn cut through the inn's hush. Relief and fear mingled in Arthur's chest as the servant woman emerged, holding a tiny, wailing babe. "A girl!" she breathed, half in awe. "Your Grace, it's a girl." Arthur, hardly daring to believe, stepped forward. The baby's hair was pale as moonlight, just as Targaryens were said to have. She let out a piercing cry, her fists trembling. The servant's eyes shone. "The Queen! She is weak, but alive." Arthur and Sir Willem hurried inside, hearts racing. The innkeeper was wiping Rhaella's brow with a damp cloth, while Rhaella looked exhausted, her eyes half-lidded. But when she saw her daughter, she let out a trembling breath. "Daenerys," she whispered. "I will name her Daenerys, after my grandmother." The baby was handed to her, and Rhaella held her close, tears slipping down her cheeks. Arthur stood beside the bed, sword in hand as if he could ward off any danger in this small inn. Ser Willem hovered just behind him, equally awed. "Daenerys Targaryen," Arthur murmured. "May she grow strong." Rhaella turned her gaze to him, her face etched with pain and relief. She smiled, though her lips quivered with exhaustion. "May she outlive the terrors that have befallen our house." Arthur gently placed his free hand on the hilt of Dawn. "She shall have my protection, as I have sworn to you, my queen." Rhaella leaned her head back, eyes closing in weariness. "Thank you, Sir Arthur. Let her be the hope of House Targaryen." They stayed at the inn for over a week while Rhaella recovered. Each day, Daenerys's cries grew stronger. The old innkeeper seemed to take pride in caring for the newborn, though she grumbled about the fuss. Meanwhile, the queen slowly regained some color in her cheeks, though she was still frail. Arthur used that time to ensure their road to Pentos was clear, venturing out to speak with local travelers. Most paid them no mind, but a few cast suspicious glances at the pale-haired woman and her infant. Arthur debated the wisdom of staying longer, but Rhaella was in no shape to travel. The babe needed rest and a safe environment as well. Yet they risked rumor spreading. Each day that passed increased the chance that word might reach King Robert's ears. Tales of a silver-haired noblewoman birthing a child in a remote inn. Though Essos was vast, Arthur's fear of pursuit gnawed at him. At last, once Rhaella could stand and walk short distances with assistance, they resumed their journey. The innkeeper was paid generously for her kindness. Then Arthur and Ser Willem guided the carriage once again onto the winding road. Daenerys was bundled in soft linens, sleeping fitfully in her mother's arms. Despite the queen's fragile health, a small spark of hope had ignited within her. She had a daughter again, a life born from the ashes of so many losses. The next few days saw them finally approach the outskirts of Pentos. The climate grew warmer, the land richer. Vines and tall grasses lined the road. The city itself soon appeared, sprawling near the sea, ringed by high walls. Pentos was known for its wealth, its powerful magisters, and its labyrinth of politics. Here, exiled lords, princes, and even dethroned kings had come to scheme or hide throughout the centuries. Arthur knew their arrival had to be discreet. They could not simply ride up to the gates and announce themselves. Ser Willem had a contact, a minor merchant who had once served in King Aerys's court as a translator. Arthur, wary but lacking options, allowed the meeting. They rode into Pentos under the guise of a Westerosi noblewoman seeking asylum after losing her lands in the rebellion. The merchant, a gaunt man named Garin, recognized Ser Willem and quickly offered them a modest villa outside the city walls, near a small orchard. That villa became their sanctuary. It was far from grand, but it provided privacy, high walls, and a gate guarded by hired men who, after receiving a pouch of gold, swore loyalty. Arthur scouted the area thoroughly before allowing the queen inside. A cobbled courtyard surrounded by pillars offered some respite from the bustle of Pentos. A fountain trickled in the center, overshadowed by a lone olive tree. Several rooms branched off from the courtyard, each with narrow windows shuttered against the heat. Rhaella took to her new quarters with an air of quiet resignation. She spent her days nursing Daenerys and occasionally walking in the courtyard when her strength allowed. Arthur and Ser Willem conferred about next steps. They needed to find a more permanent arrangement, perhaps secure an alliance with a powerful magister or at least find a network of Targaryen loyalists in exile. Rumors circulated that the Golden Company, founded long ago by a Targaryen bastard, might be sympathetic, but that was a dangerous gambit. As days turned into weeks, Arthur ventured into the city to gather information. He learned that Illyrio Mopatis, a wealthy magister known for hosting exiled nobility, was indeed in Pentos. Some whispered that he trafficked in secrets and slaves, though Arthur could not confirm. Others said he was cunning but also pragmatic. If the price was right or the opportunity beneficial, he might shelter the last Targaryens. Returning to the villa one afternoon, Arthur found the courtyard uncharacteristically tense. The hired guards at the gate spoke to him in hurried tones. A visitor had arrived, someone claiming to know of their identity. Alarmed, Arthur stepped inside. There, by the fountain, stood a tall Braavosi man with oiled hair and a flamboyant green doublet. He wore a rapier at his side. Ser Willem was already there, hand on the hilt of his sword, glaring. The Braavosi bowed deeply to Arthur. "Ser Arthur Dayne, I presume," he said in a lilting accent. Arthur stiffened. "Who are you?" "I am Tacho Moris, a humble businessman," the Braavosi replied. "Word in the city is that a fallen Westerosi queen might be hiding here with her newborn child. I come bearing an offer of friendship and perhaps opportunity." Arthur's eyes narrowed. "What do you know of us?" Tacho laughed lightly. "Only that the Targaryen name once carried great weight, and I suspect that if the queen is alive, she might be in need of funds, protection, alliances. My associates in Bravos are always willing to invest in, well, let's say, interesting prospects." Ser Willem's face was red with anger. "How did you find us?" Tacho waved a hand dismissively. "The same way anyone finds a lost treasure. Good coin spent in the right ears. Fear not, my interest is purely mercantile. If the queen wishes to remain in hiding, I can offer that. If she wishes to reclaim her throne, I can hint at ways to gather support. For a price, of course." Arthur's grip on Dawn's pommel tightened. He exchanged a glance with Ser Willem, who looked ready to run this Braavosi through. But Arthur spoke carefully. "We have no interest in rash decisions," he said. "Leave us. We will summon you if the queen wishes to speak." Tacho gave another sweeping bow. "As you wish. Should you need me, ask for Tacho Moris at the Mummers Crescent, a tavern by the western gate. I shall remain in Pentos for a time." He departed with a confident stride, leaving behind a swirl of tension. Arthur approached Ser Willem, who let out a breath. "We're exposed," the older knight muttered. "It was only a matter of time." Arthur rubbed his temples. "We must speak with the queen, decide if we should accept an offer like his or if we should move. But traveling again could be even more dangerous." They went to Rhaella's chambers, where she was rocking Daenerys gently. The infant was fussing, her tiny fists trembling in the warm air. Rhaella looked up, concern etched in her features. "What is wrong?" Arthur knelt beside her, telling her of the Braavosi visitor. She listened, her face paling at the realization that their anonymity was compromised. A hush followed. Daenerys whimpered, and Rhaella cooed softly, trying to soothe her. At length she spoke. "Essos is large and rumor travels swiftly. If one man knows we are here, others will soon know as well. We cannot remain hidden forever. The question is, do we hide deeper or do we try to gather some measure of power?" Her gaze flicked to Arthur. "My child, my last living child, deserves more than a life in constant flight." Arthur bowed his head. "We could attempt to ally with Magister Illyrio or test this Braavosi's sincerity. But any alliance here could come with great cost, and we do not have endless gold. The crown's treasury is lost to us." Ser Willem, standing behind Arthur, cleared his throat. "We can try to approach Illyrio. He's known for lavish displays. Perhaps he would shelter the queen in exchange for promises of future reward, should House Targaryen ever reclaim the throne." Rhaella closed her eyes. "The throne," she whispered, her tone heavy with sadness. "So much blood has been shed. Part of me wonders if I should forsake all claims and simply vanish, for the sake of my daughter's life. Let Westeros remain under the usurper. Let the Targaryen name die with me. But," she looked down at Daenerys's tiny face, "if we do not preserve our lineage, then all my children died for naught. Rhaegar believed in a prophecy. He believed our bloodline was meant for something greater, and I cannot let that hope fade, no matter how small it seems." Arthur felt a tug in his chest. Rhaegar's talk of the prince that was promised, the songs of ice and fire, it had once filled their hearts with purpose. Now that dream lay tattered. But perhaps Rhaella was right. Perhaps a shred of that destiny still lived in Daenerys. He spoke carefully. We might remain here in Pentos under Illyrio's protection until Daenerys is older. Then, if an opportunity arises to press her claim, we can decide. For now, your health and her safety are paramount, Your Grace." She nodded. Yes, safety first. Within the week, they made discreet contact with Magister Illyrio Mopatis. A single messenger boy was sent to request a private audience. Illyrio responded promptly, inviting them to his manse on the outskirts of Pentos. That evening, Arthur, Ser Willem, and Rhaella, veiled in a hooded cloak with Daenerys swaddled, traveled in a covered litter to the Magister's estate. The property was a sprawling compound of marble columns, exotic gardens, and mosaic floors that depicted scenes of Pentosi legends. Illyrio met them in a grand hall, wearing robes of saffron silk. He was a large man, fleshy and soft, with jeweled rings on every finger. A carefully trimmed beard framed his mouth, and his dark eyes gleamed with curiosity. He bowed deeply to Rhaella, who inclined her head, too weary to stand on ceremony. The Magister clapped his hands, and servants brought out platters of roasted duck, spiced honeyed figs, and rare wines. Rhaella ate sparingly, and Daenerys remained quiet, seemingly soothed by the warm interior of the manse. Arthur and Ser Willem observed every face, every guard, prepared for a trick. But Illyrio merely smiled, playing the generous host. Eventually, the conversation turned to delicate matters. "Your Grace," Illyrio said, leaning forward, "I am honored by your presence. Your house, the noble Targaryens, have reigned over Westeros for nearly 3 centuries. It pains me to see you in exile." Rhaella lifted her gaze. "You know who I am, then?" He nodded, one ring-clad hand resting on a plump thigh. "I do indeed, and I know that your child is but days old. It must have been a harrowing journey." He lowered his voice in a show of sympathy that may or may not have been genuine. "Allow me to offer you my hospitality. My manse is at your disposal, and I can secure the best caretakers for little Daenerys." His eyes flicked toward Arthur. "I see you have a fine knight, the legendary sword of the morning. But one knight cannot stand against armies or assassins alone. My guards are loyal, and my walls are high." Ser Willem bristled slightly, but said nothing. Rhaella placed a hand gently on Daenerys's bundle, as if to shield her from the world. "We have limited funds, Magister," she admitted quietly. "What would you require of us in return for such generous protection?" Illyrio spread his hands in an expansive gesture. "A trifling share in whatever fortune may come your way should your house regain the throne. Be it lands, trade rights, or influence in Westeros. Nothing so immediate as gold now." His smile broadened. "I am a patient man." Arthur studied him. Illyrio Mopatis had the air of someone who understood the value of hidden investments. Taking in an exiled queen and her newborn might yield great returns if ever Daenerys took the Iron Throne, or if the Targaryens gained enough power to hand out lucrative favors. Illyrio's risk was not small. If the new king learned of this, he might pressure Pentos or orchestrate retribution. But clearly, Illyrio believed the potential rewards were worth it. Rhaella and her knights exchanged silent glances. In truth, they had few alternatives. Remaining at Garen's villa indefinitely would bleed their resources dry, and it was not as secure. Here, at least, they would have a roof and armed guards. They might need to navigate Illyrio's manipulations, but for the moment, he seemed genuine in his willingness to host them. Rhaella exhaled slowly. "Very well, Magister. We accept your offer of shelter. We shall be no trouble, I assure you." Illyrio beamed. "Marvelous. I shall have rooms prepared for you immediately. May this arrangement bring us mutual prosperity." That night, as they settled into a lavish suite in Illyrio's estate, Arthur found himself alone in a corridor, gazing out at the moonlit gardens. The weight of his vow bore down on him again. He remembered the Tower of Joy, the heartbreak on the Trident, the final stand of his fellow Kingsguard. Yet he had survived to do what? To ensure the Targaryens endured. If protecting this queen and her babe meant a pact with a cunning Magister, then so be it. Honor demanded he do whatever was necessary. In the weeks that followed, A tense calm settled over their lives. Rhaella regained some strength in the comfort of Illyrio's manse, though her health remained fragile. Daenerys thrived, growing from a tiny pink infant into a bright-eyed baby who gurgled at her mother's lullabies. Arthur devoted his days to overseeing the guards, training them in the Westerosi style of discipline. Illyrio had allowed Arthur nominal command over them in recognition of his skill. Outside the manse, Pentos pulsed with gossip, commerce, and the swirl of rumors that permeated every corner of Essos. Arthur heard conflicting stories. Some said Robert Baratheon's rule was stabilizing. Others claimed rebellion still simmered in the Reach or Dorne. The truth was elusive. There were even whispers that Elia Martell's kin in Dorne sought vengeance, fueling the idea that House Targaryen might have allies if ever they returned to Westeros. Rhaella rarely ventured beyond the manse's gardens. She walked slowly, sometimes leaning on Arthur's arm when Ser Willem was otherwise occupied. In those moments, her eyes would drift to the horizon, over the high walls. "I miss the cliffs of Dragonstone," she said softly one day, as Daenerys wriggled in her arms. "I never thought I would, but I do. I miss my children, Rhaegar, Aegon, Rhaenys." Her voice caught, and she kissed Daenerys's downy head. "All I can do now is live for this one." Arthur saw the gleam of tears at the corners of her violet eyes. "They would be proud of you, Your Grace," he murmured. She smiled faintly but did not reply. The loss was too great for any words to truly soothe. Sometimes, Illyrio hosted feasts or gatherings, inviting various Pentoshi lords and merchants. Rhaella made only the briefest of appearances, shielded by a veil, introduced as a distant noble guest recovering from an illness. Arthur escorted her, ensuring no one came too close or asked too many questions. Illyrio's guests seemed more interested in their host's famed hospitality than in prying into the veiled woman's secrets. Still, Arthur noticed some curious glances. Nothing in Pentos remained hidden forever. Despite the relative safety, a restlessness grew within Arthur. He would wake in the dead of night, hand on dawn's hilt, expecting an attack that never came. The guilt of survival gnawed at him. He wondered if it had been better to die with his fellow Kingsguard at the Tower of Joy than live in exile, uncertain of his ultimate purpose. But then he would see Daenerys, giggling in her mother's arms, and remember that here was a chance for House Targaryen's future, and for him to honor his oaths in a way that had not been possible on a corpse-littered battlefield. Time passed in this uneasy fashion, measured by Daenerys's growth and Rhaella's slow convalescence. By the time Daenerys was a few moons old, her hair shone like spun silver, and her lilac eyes took in the world with bright curiosity. Her laughter brought a rare smile to Arthur's face. He found himself forging an odd paternal protectiveness over the child, though he was no father, only a sworn shield. Still, he taught her to grasp his finger, and she would coo with delight. It was during a mild evening, the breeze carrying the faint scent of the jade sea spices from Illyrio's kitchens, that Rhaella confided her fears to Arthur. She was seated near a brazier in the garden, Daenerys dozing in a small cradle close by. The soft flicker of firelight danced across her delicate features. "Ser Arthur," she said, her voice almost a whisper, "I do not know how long my health will hold. The maester we summoned, if he can be called a maester, warns me that my childbearing years have strained my body too greatly. If I—" She faltered, then steadied herself. "If I do not live to see my daughter grow, promise me you will remain by her side." A surge of sorrow and loyalty welled up in Arthur. "Your Grace," he said, kneeling on one knee before her, "I swear upon my honor as a knight, upon the memory of those who fell, I will protect Princess Daenerys with my life. I will see her safe. I will teach her the histories of her lineage, so she knows who she is." Tears glittered in Rhaella's eyes. She reached out and briefly touched his cheek, a gesture of gratitude that made him close his eyes. "Thank you," she said. "If only my son Rhaegar could see this." He believed in a song of ice and fire, in a destiny that awaited our bloodline. Perhaps that destiny now rests with Daenerys. Arthur could offer no grand answer. He simply stood and bowed his head, committing himself again to the vow that had defined his life: protect the Targaryens, come what may. The months that followed were comparatively peaceful, though the shadow of uncertainty loomed. Word reached them through Illyrio that King Robert's rule was indeed solidifying. Eddard Stark had become his hand, Tywin Lannister had cemented alliances, and the realm seemed, at least on the surface, to be moving past the bloodshed of the rebellion. Yet old wounds festered, especially in Dorne, according to rumors. For now, Robert had not launched an active search for the exiled Targaryens. Either he assumed them dead or did not deem them a threat. Arthur did not let that lull him into complacency. He doubled the guard around Rhaella's chambers, ensuring no strange visitors could gain entry without his knowledge. He took to training daily in the courtyard with the manse's guards, practicing sword forms and drilling them in defensive formations. Dawn remained a symbol of House Dayne's storied history, but more importantly, it was a living weapon that might yet be called upon to defend the Targaryen heir. During that time, Rhaella continued to improve, though her health never returned to what it had been in her youth. She remained prone to bouts of fever and fatigue. Daenerys, on the other hand, flourished. She crawled across the polished floors, babbling strings of syllables that made the servants laugh. Occasionally, the child would stare at Arthur or Ser Willem with wide eyes, reaching out small hands as if sensing their protective presence. And so their little court in exile survived. An ailing queen, a baby princess, 2 loyal knights, and the cunning magister who housed them. Yet behind every feast, behind every polite conversation, was the knowledge that this fragile peace could shatter. Essos was a land of sellswords and shifting loyalties. If an agent of Robert Baratheon offered enough coin, or if another exiled pretender sought advantage, the Targaryens could be betrayed in the blink of an eye. Despite these fears, Rhaella found fleeting moments of contentment. She would sit on a cushioned bench in the garden, Daenerys on her lap, humming an old lullaby from the days of the Red Keep. Arthur, passing by, would sometimes pause to listen. He recalled seeing Rhaella at formal court gatherings long ago, overshadowed by her husband's erratic reign. Now, in exile, she was free from Aerys' cruelty, but she had lost almost everything else. The lullaby she sang carried a sorrowful melody, yet Daenerys smiled, oblivious to the tragedies that paved her path. Occasionally, Rhaella would speak of Rhaegar. She'd recall his love of music, how he once believed in the prophecy that a dragon must have 3 heads. She spoke of Aegon, Rhaenys, the joys and heartbreak of motherhood. Each story was tinged with an unspoken longing for what might have been. Arthur listened quietly. He recalled the Crown Prince's ideals, the way Rhaegar had led the charge at the Trident. He had believed so fervently that he was fighting for a righteous cause. But in the end, war is a cruel arbiter. Now, Rhaella and Daenerys represented the last flicker of that cause, hidden away in a foreign manse. Time marched on, measured in the small triumphs of Daenerys' growth. Her first steps, her first attempts at forming words. Rhaella's face lit with pride, albeit tempered by the realization that these milestones took place in Pentos, not in the halls of her forefathers. Arthur found a bittersweet joy in watching the princess flourish, knowing that each day she grew stronger was another day House Targaryen endured. Yet no refuge in Essos could remain untouched by politics forever. One evening, while Ser Willem and Arthur dined with Illyrio in a private salon, the Magister leaned forward with a conspiratorial grin. "My friends," he said, swirling a goblet of honeyed wine, "you will be pleased to know that I have been in touch with certain sellsword captains. Some might be open to aligning themselves with a Targaryen restoration, should the rightful queen desire it." Ser Willem's brow furrowed. "Are you suggesting open rebellion against King Robert?" Illyrio shrugged, the folds of his silk robe shifting. "Only if an opportunity presents itself. The Golden Company, for instance, was founded by a Targaryen bastard, Bittersteel. They may have an interest in supporting Daenerys in the future, particularly if gold is plentiful." Arthur tensed. The Queen has not indicated she wishes to launch an invasion of Westeros anytime soon. He paused, remembering how Rhaella had debated the futility of such an attempt with only a handful of supporters. Nor do we have the means. Illyrio raised an eyebrow. Yet seeds must be planted early, allies cultivated. Should Robert Baratheon's grip weaken, perhaps due to internal strife, you want to be ready to strike. He sipped his wine, eyes glittering. If I can broker such alliances, it might prove beneficial in the long term. Arthur glanced at Ser Willem. Both knights knew that they were not the ones to make such decisions. Only Rhaella, as the reigning Targaryen by blood, could choose. Yet Rhaella was focused on raising her daughter, not plunging Westeros into another war. The pain of the rebellion was still raw. Arthur politely reminded Illyrio that no immediate plans for restoration were underway. Illyrio nodded affably, but Arthur could see the calculations behind his eyes. This was a man who positioned himself to profit from the future, no matter how distant. Later that night, Arthur informed Rhaella of Illyrio's suggestion. She listened, stroking Daenerys's hair as the child lay half asleep in her arms. A thunderstorm rattled the windows, and Rhaella's expression mirrored the unease of the sky. "I cannot bring more bloodshed to the realm," she whispered. "Too many have died. My family, Elia Martell, her children." She squeezed her eyes shut, as if warding off the memory of Aegon and Rhaenys. Then she looked at Daenerys, whose small hand clutched at her mother's gown. Still, one day, Daenerys might wish to claim what is hers by birthright, but that is her choice to make when she is grown. Arthur bowed. "I understand, Your Grace. For now, we will stay the course, remain safe, and ensure the princess flourishes." Rhaella nodded gratefully. "Yes, that is enough." The storm raged through the night, rain hammering the rooftops. Arthur stood guard outside Rhaella's chamber, listening to the downpour and the occasional crack of thunder. In the flickering torchlight, his memories drifted back to the day he knelt before the royal family, swearing the King's Guard oath. He could never have imagined it leading here. Yet, for all the heartbreak, at least this newborn Targaryen had survived. In that fragile life lay a thread of hope for House Targaryen, for the ideals Rhaegar once championed, and for Arthur's own battered sense of duty. By the next morning, the sky had cleared. Sunshine bathed the city of Pentos in golden light, and droplets clung to the lush foliage in Illyrio's gardens. Arthur made his daily circuit, checking the guards and scanning the compound's walls. Then he moved indoors to see if Rhaella needed anything. He found her in the central hall, rocking Daenerys gently while a minstrel played a soft melody on a lute. She beckoned Arthur closer. "Listen to this tune," she said with a trace of a smile. "It's Pentosian style, but it reminds me of the old songs we once heard at King's Landing." Arthur listened. The notes were lilting and sweet, with a slightly exotic flavor. Daenerys squirmed, eyes fixed on the minstrel, who performed with polite concentration. Arthur found himself recalling Rhaegar's own skill with the harp, how the prince's music had once moved audiences to tears. Perhaps, in another life, Rhaegar would have been a minstrel rather than a warrior. When the song ended, Rhaella thanked the minstrel and dismissed him. She turned to Arthur, her expression thoughtful. "Life goes on, no matter how much we lose. The world does not stop spinning for a single house. But we Targaryens must find our place in it again." Arthur inclined his head. "And you shall. Daenerys will live to see a new chapter for your house." She nodded, though a shadow of doubt lingered in her eyes. "I can only hope you are right." The weeks slid into months. Daenerys approached her first name day, a bright and inquisitive child. She began babbling ma and da, sometimes reaching for Arthur or Ser Willem. Rhaella's health waned in waves. Some days, she seemed almost her old self, walking in the gardens and humming lullabies, while on other days, she remained in bed, too fatigued to rise. The passing of time became a precarious balance of fear and fragile joys. Illyrio continued to host banquets and navigate Pentoshi politics. He shared scraps of intelligence with Arthur when it suited him. News from Westeros indicated that Robert was settling into kingship, forging alliances, and siring bastards across the realm. Ned Stark's presence as Hand of the King apparently kept some measure of honor in the court. but tensions with House Lannister brewed, especially with Cersei as queen. Still, no mention was made of a serious search for Targaryen exiles. It was as if Robert and his allies had decided that any survivors posed no true threat. Arthur recognized that it was in their favor to be underestimated or forgotten. He urged caution to Illyrio whenever the Magister hinted at more aggressive moves. The last thing they needed was to draw King Robert's ire before Daenerys was even old enough to speak. Ser Willem shared Arthur's viewpoint, though he sometimes mused about returning to Westeros with a small band of loyalists, sowing rebellion in Aegon's name. But that was more a feverish dream than a practical strategy. Aegon was gone. Only Daenerys remained. One evening, after Daenerys had been laid down in her crib, Arthur stood in a corridor, staring at a tapestry depicting some Pentoshi myth. He thought he heard a wheezing sound from the queen's chambers. Alarmed, he hurried to the door, finding it slightly ajar. Rhaella was inside, half doubled over, coughing violently. He rushed to her side, laying a hand on her back, calling for help. Her face was flushed, eyes watery. She raised a trembling hand to cover her mouth. I'm fine," she tried to say, but another cough seized her. Arthur helped her to a chair, panic surging. A feverish heat radiated from her skin. Servants arrived with cloths and water, and Arthur sent for the local physician Illyrio kept on retainer. The physician arrived quickly, a stout man who reeked of pungent herbs. He examined Rhaella with a detached manner, placing a hand against her brow, listening to her labored breathing. Finally, he sighed. "Her lungs are weak, and she is running a fever. We must keep her warm. Give her a tincture of willow bark and thyme. She should rest. This could worsen if not treated promptly." Arthur's heart pounded. Rhaella's condition had always been precarious, but this seemed more dire. He stayed by her bedside through the night, wiping her brow, watching as she drifted in and out of fitful sleep. Sometime after midnight, she woke with a start, her eyes wide and unfocused. "Where is Daenerys?" she rasped. "Safe, your grace. She's with her nurse in the adjoining chamber," Arthur soothed. Rhaella tried to sit up, but exhaustion overcame her. She sank back into the pillows, tears slipping from the corners of her eyes. "My child," she whispered. "I must protect my child." Arthur gently clasped her hand. "You already have. I promise on my life, Daenerys will be safe." She swallowed hard, managing a faint nod. If I, her voice broke. He bowed his head, voice trembling with empathy. "I will not let harm befall her. She will live, and she will know who she is." A tearful smile ghosted over Rhaella's lips. "Thank you, Arthur. You have always been the truest of knights." He stayed until dawn, dozing in a chair beside her bed, awakened now and then by her soft coughs. The physician returned, adjusting her treatment and warning that she needed absolute rest. Over the next few days, her fever spiked, then cooled, then rose again. Daenerys was kept away to avoid illness, leaving the princess wailing for her mother at times. Arthur took on the role of comforter, walking with the infant in the garden, humming a lullaby he dimly remembered from childhood. In the hush of one twilight, as the fever's hold seemed to tighten, Rhaella beckoned for Daenerys to be brought to her. Arthur gently carried the infant in, kneeling by the bed so Rhaella could see her child's face. Rhaella's breath rattled in her chest, and her eyes shone with love and desperation. She managed to brush her trembling fingers over Daenerys's silver wisps of hair. "My sweet girl," she whispered, tears slipping down her cheeks. Daenerys cooed, reaching a tiny hand toward her mother. Rhaella gave a fragile smile. "You are the last dragon," she murmured, her gaze flicking up to Arthur for a moment, then back to Daenerys. "May the gods watch over you always." Arthur swallowed the lump in his throat, gently leaning the baby closer so Rhaella could press a kiss to her forehead. After a moment, he withdrew, for fear that the queen's trembling arms might not hold the infant safely. The sorrow in Rhaella's eyes was a wound Arthur could hardly bear to witness. Daenerys fussed, sensing the tension, and Arthur quietly left the room to return her to the nurse. Through that long night, Arthur and Ser Willem maintained a vigil. Illyrio's physician came and went, delivering more potions. Servants carried in bowls of steaming water to help Rhaella breathe more easily. Yet, by the gray light of dawn, she was in worse condition. Her skin had grown clammy, her eyes distant and hollow. Arthur recognized the look of someone near death. He had seen it too many times on the battlefield. She drifted in and out of delirium, calling for Rhaegar, for Aegon, for Rhaenys. Several times, she whispered to Arthur, asking him to protect Daenerys. Each time, he reaffirmed his oath, tears burning in his eyes. By midday, her breathing was shallow, rattling with every exhalation. Ser Willem stood by the bed, tears streaking his aged cheeks. Rhaella's violet eyes flickered open for one final moment. She looked at Arthur, then Ser Willem, then seemed to gaze at some far-off memory. Her lips parted, a whisper of a name, perhaps Rhaegar's, escaping on her last breath. Then she was still. Arthur bowed his head, raw grief flooding him. Ser Willem sank to his knees, sobbing into his hands. The queen was dead, leaving behind a year-old daughter as the last Targaryen in the world. Arthur felt the weight of that truth crash down upon him. He gently closed Rhaella's eyes. The silence in the room was deafening. Outside, Pentos carried on as always, unaware that the exiled queen of Westeros had just passed from the world. Arthur realized, with a cold clarity, that it was now up to him and Ser Willem to safeguard Daenerys. The promise he had made to Rhaella, protect the child at all costs, would define every step he took from this moment forward. Illyrio was informed of the queen's death. His expression was one of carefully measured sympathy. It was impossible to know how much was genuine and how much was political posturing. He offered to host a small funeral according to Westerosi rites. Arthur and Ser Willem agreed, wanting to give Rhaella a semblance of the honor that had been stripped from her by war and exile. The funeral was held in a secluded courtyard of Illyrio's estate, the body dressed in a simple white gown, crowned with a wreath of winter roses that Arthur had managed to find in a Pentoshi greenhouse. A visiting septon, bribed into discretion, conducted a brief service. Daenerys was too young to understand, though she fussed in Ser Willem's arms, perhaps sensing the somber air. Arthur placed Dawn at his side, bowing his head. He heard the old septon's words about the mother's mercy, the stranger's domain. He remembered how Rhaella had once looked, regal and determined, as she fled Dragonstone. Now her ashes would be scattered in a foreign land, far from the resting places of her ancestors. When the ceremony ended, Arthur gently took Daenerys from Ser Willem, letting the girl's small hand curl around his finger. She cooed, turning her bright lilac eyes toward him. In that innocent gaze, he saw the reflection of all the duties he had yet to fulfill, all the perils that lay ahead. She was the living embodiment of House Targaryen, the last scion, too young and too fragile to bear the weight of history. He swore anew, silently, that he would be her shield and sword until she no longer needed him. That vow gave him a purpose that transcended fear, guilt, or sorrow. He was Arthur Dayne, the Sword of the Morning, sworn to protect the Targaryen line, and he would do so here in Essos, in Pentos, or wherever fate led them. The days after Rhaella's passing were quiet and uncertain. Ser Willem seemed lost in grief. He had served House Targaryen for decades, watched it crumble, and now found himself guardian to an orphan princess. Illyrio offered to maintain his patronage, noting that while the queen might be gone, the princess still held potential for the future. Arthur, seeing no better alternative, agreed. They would remain in Pentos, at least for now. Daenerys needed a stable environment. Illyrio made sure their living quarters were comfortable, perhaps hoping to secure the young Targaryen's gratitude when she came of age. Arthur spent his time training, drilling the household guards and tending to Daenerys. Ser Willem took on more of a grandfatherly role, bouncing the child on his knee, teaching her small words. At night, the two knights would speak of the past and the uncertain future. They were exiles, tasked with raising a royal child who one day might claim a throne across the narrow sea. Arthur seldom slept deeply, haunted by memories of Rhaella's final days and the vow he had made. He knew the path ahead would be fraught with danger and intrigue. And as Daenerys grew, so too would the expectations placed upon her by those seeking to use her name. But for now, she was just a child, needing milk, warmth, and love. Arthur resolved to give her all he could, as a knight and a guardian in a strange land. So began the new chapter of House Targaryen's story, far from the Red Keep's throne room, across the sea in the manse of a Pentoshi magister. A single baby girl, born amid storms and sorrow, nurtured by a mother whose final wish was her child's survival, protected by a legendary knight whose sense of honor bound him to her fate. Together, they existed on the edge of the known world, clinging to the fragile ember of a bloodline that had once conquered dragons and kingdoms alike. And Arthur Dayne stood watch, Dawn ever at his side, prepared to defend Daenerys Targaryen against whatever trials destiny would cast her way. If the gods were good, she would live to reclaim her birthright or choose her own path. If the gods were cruel, Arthur would stand against them all the same. He had made an oath, and nothing, no storm, no betrayal, no distance, would break it. So he vowed, in the silent courtyard, as the last embers of Rhaella's funeral pyre smoldered in the night air. He was a Kingsguard knight without a king, but he was still a knight, and Daenerys was still a Targaryen. In that precarious truth, he found the strength to keep going. And so his watch continued, under the foreign stars of Essos, far from the home he once knew. His blade and his honor would shine bright, no matter how dark the path became. For the child in his arms was hope itself, and hope was worth any sacrifice.